Today on Expert Insights, I'm talking with Associate Professor Cathrine Neilson-Hewitt, who heads up the Early Years program here at the University of Wollongong. Welcome, Cathrine.
Hi, Leanne. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well.
That's great. So today we're going to be talking about self-regulation in young children. Let's start by telling about what self-regulation is and giving that some sort of description.
Yeah. So when we're talking about self-regulation, we're really talking about children's ability to modify their behaviours and emotions in accordance to situational demands. So it's their ability to do something that they don't want to do, or stop doing something that they'd really like to keep doing. So let's say they want to keep playing with a toy, but it's time to pack up. They can respond to those demands from an adult and pack up the toy and put it away, even though they want to keep playing with it. And it's also about children's ability to delay gratification or to suppress their behaviours or emotions long enough to think about the consequences of their behaviours. So let's say you've got a set of glasses that I actually think would look much nicer on my face than yours, and I'd like to just grab those. Now, they might be your new glasses. You're going to get pretty upset with me. There's something that you'd like to wear, and then you might get really upset. Doug's going to come over and try and console you, and I'm going to feel really bad, and I might get in trouble off Doug, and other things will happen. The idea is the child who can self-regulate can really think about the consequences. So I might think, if I grab those glasses, Leanne's going to get really upset. So instead I'm going to say, Leanne, when you're finished with the glasses, can I actually have them? Because I really like them. So it's that ability to kind of read the situational demands and shift our behaviours accordingly. And it's important as parents to know not to get it confused with compliance. So when children are compliant, they behave in accordance to the demands of an adult, and they behave that way when the adult is present, but may behave quite poorly or aggressively or inappropriately in the absence of an adult. So a child who is really self-regulated can behave the same way independent of whether an adult is present or absent. So that's the behavioural and emotional component of self-regulation. There's also a cognitive component, so a thinking component. And that's really about children's ability to plan, to remember, to be motivated, and really kind of pay attention. And that's the cognitive. We often refer to it as the higher order or executive function components of self-regulation, but they're both related. So we know emotions influence thinking, and thinking influences emotion. So a child who gets really anxious when faced with a challenging task is much more likely to give up and walk away from that task compared to a child who can regulate these really big emotions, like this is really tricky, but it's really tricky, but I'm going to keep having a go. And so that ability to kind of engage and continue to try a task is probably one of the most important outcomes of self-regulation in terms of learning. So as a parent, I like to talk about the emotional or social parts of self-regulation as being like our thermostat. So the idea is we have an ideal temperature. When the temperature outside goes too high or too low, the thermostat kicks in and it brings us down to that level of functionality or level of comfort. Whereas the cognitive component of self-regulation is like our air traffic control system. So it brings all the information, we reassess our play, we try things out, we think about it, and we resist the temptation to make hasty decisions. And they're two really important aspects of children's self-regulation, which we know impacts their learning and it impacts their social relationships.
It's very sophisticated interactions going on here. So Let's just start then with thinking about the continuum of self-regulation. You know, you're talking about my glasses, and it seems to be a very high order skill to resist that urge to take those glasses and put them on. But in thinking about where's our starting point with self-regulation and what's the continuum there?
I think that there's a number of factors that influence children's self-regulation. So there's certainly the developmental underpinnings of self-regulation. So we move from a phase of what I would call other regulated. So when we're born, where often it's our parents who determine when we eat, when we sleep, or we like to determine when babies sleep, but that doesn't always happen. But really our lives
and babies tell us when they're going to sleep.
That was definitely my experience. But we're regulated by others. So, and we're not really able to regulate our own emotions and behaviours, and we fight for resources and we fight for toys, and we cry the minute that we need some comfort, or we need food. And so that's that other regulated. And then we move into a phase of what I call co-regulation. And that's very a relational construct where there's support from adults or more capable peers. So where we might actually support children's behaviour, we may other kind of that co-regulation can happen where we say, in 5 minutes, Leanne, we're going to pack up our toys and then we're going to go outside. So it's really that idea of giving children support around being able to regulate their ideas, as opposed to me saying, it's time to pack up, let's go outside. Then the idea is that we move from the other or kind of that co-regulated phase to self-regulation. But we really are not ready to start to regulate our own behaviours and emotions until we hit around the age of 3. So there is that kind of movement and continuum. But I will say there was the belief that once you moved from a co-regulated state to a self-regulated state, that's where you are. But we know the reality is that children move from self-regulated to co-regulated depending on the demands of their environment. So if we think about self-regulation as being a muscle, and you know when you go to the gym and you might start lifting weights at the beginning of the session and the weights aren't so hard to lift and you do your sets, and by you get to your 3rd set, those last kind of lifting is pretty heavy, your muscles are tired and it's really hard and it takes a lot of energy. And that's like self-regulation. So children, when there's lots of demands that are put on them in terms of the environment, so they might be tired, they might be hungry, they might be engaging in a really difficult task, they may be asked to do too many things, then their ability to regulate their emotions and behaviours becomes quite challenged. And they move back into that need of support from adults. And there's lots of things that can actually put strain on our self-regulatory muscles. So things like those environmental demands or stress or changes in children's environment. So we certainly move. And I think that's something that's important to think, particularly in the current climate around COVID and the stresses that's put there, that children who haven't really attained that strong sense of self-regulation are going to need more support from other adults in their environment. So we see it move that way. So there's that developmental perspective, but there's also a domain notion of development, and that's that idea is that we tend to develop control and regulation over our behaviours, and then our emotions, and then our thinking is the last. And we really continue to develop self or cognitive regulation right up till about 22 years of age. So it's certainly developmentally we start developing, and the ages between 3 and 5 are a peak period for the development of self-regulatory skills, because we move out of that, the me of the toddler years to the we of the preschool years. And in terms of self-regulation, we have to have an understanding that others have desires and beliefs and thoughts and needs that are different from my own. And sometimes I have to actually park my own needs and desires to think about others. So we need to have that capacity to be able to do that before we can regulate. But in terms of the thinking and the planning and that higher order, it really continues to develop right through the school years and right up to young adulthood.
And I am guessing that the way that self-regulation develops in the early years has an impact, obviously, on how evolved that becomes in the later years when we're talking about our 22-year-old.
Absolutely. I think we know, and we both subscribe to this view of the significance of the first 5 years of a child's life, and we know they are foundational in terms of influencing children's life trajectories. But there's been some really interesting research looking at the predictive role of children's early self-regulatory behaviours on long-term outcomes. Probably one of the most significant studies, it's called the Multidisciplinary Health and Development Study, and it started back in 1972 in a little town in New Zealand called Dunedin. And they followed a birth cohort, so I think there was just over 1,000 babies that were born in 1972, and they're continuing to follow them through now. I think they're at about 48 years of age. And they did a whole lot of measures. They did health and reading and learning and lots of other measures, but they also took a measure of self-control. And they took measures of self-control at 3 and 5 and 7 and 10. But what they found was measures of self-control, which is like an indicator of self-regulation. Measures of self-control at 3 and 5 were predictive of individual differences at age 32 in terms of health, wealth and criminality. So if you had poor control of your behaviours and emotions and thoughts at 3 and 5, then you had more health issues. You're more likely to have issues around alcohol and drugs. They represented higher levels of script fills. They had issues in terms of their wealth, but they also, 24% of the original population had committed a crime by the time they were 32, which I found that quite a high proportion. And then when they looked at those individuals, the majority of those scored really poorly on self-control at 3 and 5. Okay. So it's really, I mean, scientists have suggested that self-regulation is the biological basis of learning readiness, that it is such an integral part of children's success. And we know, along with measures of oral language, self-regulation and oral language, once children start school, are some of the strongest predictors of success in terms of their learning.
Right. So in thinking about these issues around self-regulation, how can we support children's self-regulation?
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I've had the absolute privilege with some of the work that we're doing here at Early Start to be spending quite a bit of time with educators in early childhood environments and environments that are experiencing both challenge and not. So many of our services, as you know, have experienced COVID, but many of them will also experience things around the bushfires and floods. And so we've seen probably an exponential increase in challenging behaviours amongst children. And so we're really starting to think about how self-regulation fits within that. And we certainly know that self-regulation predicts poorer behaviours amongst children, but there's other things that we need to think about. And I think that's often our call to action as adults is often the behaviour, the challenging behaviours that we see. But the reality is that if we're going to support children, then we really need to think about the why. Yes. And so I've been developing with some colleagues this, I call it the 5 R's of children's behaviour.
It's always good to have some...
I love a good acronym. Can I say, I love a good acronym? Yes. And I learned that from high school science. An acronym always helps you understand things. But so the 5 R's kind of places regulation within a broader framework of understanding. So we have absolutely children's regulation, which talks about children's individual capacities and the role that plays in children's behaviour. But it also highlights the importance of relationships, respect. It looks at, as I said, regulation, but it also looks at roots, so the pathways to challenging behaviours and our responses. So our responses to children and how we can support children as parents depends on the roots to those challenging behaviours. And so it's really around contextualising that. But as a parent, the most important thing we can do for children's self-regulation is around developing responsive, trusting and reciprocal relationships. And that's critical. So we know that there's a very strong link between children who have a stronger attachment with their parents and their caregivers, that's foundational. It's around respecting children's emotions and really legitimising how they're feeling, which is different from acting out big emotions. And I think that's important to separate, that it's okay to have very big feelings. Yeah. But how do we respond to that? So that idea of respect in relationships. But when we're thinking about the responses, we go back to thinking about what are the behaviours that are important for self-regulation. So those social emotional behaviours, that ability to delay gratification. So the idea is that we do really interesting things, like there's a game called Holding Fast, which is at dinner time. And we put the dinner on the table and we say, no one's going to start their dinner until everyone's sitting down. And we're all sitting down together. So it's that idea that children need to learn to wait and to pause for a moment. So we're really thinking about what are the aspects of self-regulation. So it's really about the ability to kind of shift gears, be flexible in our thinking and problem solving. So we do games like Simon Says or Secret Shadows, so things like that you can do with parents at home. Children love Secret Shadow.
Tell me about that. I don't know what it is.
So I'd actually, if we were playing it properly, I'd actually have to get you to close your eyes and turn around.
Right.
But the idea, it's a little bit like the musical statues where we play the music and you dance and we stop the music and you stop. And that's a wonderful self-regulation game because you've got to pay attention, you've got to stop dancing. But Secret Shadow's even a little trickier. So the idea behind Secret Shadow is say, we want you to close your eyes. And so then you've got to close your eyes. And then while your eyes are closed, I'm going to describe a movement that I am doing. And then you've got to copy that movement with your eyes closed. So with your eyes closed, I'm going to say, I'm going to put my hands on my head. So from a self-regulation perspective, what that says to me is, I've got to close my eyes. It's really hard for 3 and 4-year-olds to keep their eyes closed. So that's a challenge. So that's being able to control the behaviour. But then you've got the cognitive component because you've got to pay attention to the instruction.
Right.
And then you have to act accordingly. So there's all these kind of demands about attention and control. Other wonderful things that parents can do around self-regulation is really around engaging and supporting persistence. So things like puzzles, games like snakes and ladders where you've got to learn to wait your turn, even though you might want to have a go straight away. You've got to cope with perhaps someone else beating you. So how to cope with disappointment. So there's lots of things that you can do like that for parents to really, but it's around thinking about going back to what are the behaviours that I really want to foster in my child that I know are important for their ability to regulate their emotions and behaviours and thinking.
And they're playful games that are things that everybody can engage in as well and enjoy together.
Absolutely.
So what about this element of relationships? Because that would be at the heart of any kind of games that you're playing as well. And you mentioned relationships was one of the R's. So can you talk about that?
Absolutely. So really, when we say with children, and it's really about that sense of value and that sense of voice and that sense of connection. So relationships are critical for children's self-worth. They're critical for their learning. So it's about children understanding that you are there for them, that you're going to respond to them, that you spend time with them. So it's really around those connections. But we know that that's not only important for their self-regulation, it's important for their oral language and other areas of development. So, and I think that's really important for parents because there's a lot of pressure. You've got 3 children. I've got 3 children. And there's a lot of pressure for children to do well. And the reality is the best gift you can give your child for their self-regulation and for their learning is time. And so when we're talking about those contexts of spending time and playing, like imaginative play and creative play is probably one of the strongest vehicles for developing children's self-regulation skills. Even really simple things that we say like planning. Let's play mums and dads. All right, what do you think we're going to need to play mums and dads? We can get out a map and plan that out. And it's really about empowering children. So children have to plan. They need to think about resource their play. It can go over an extended period of time. So there's things around memory and thought. So there's lots of things that we can really do as parents. And I think the other thing within the context, what relationships do for children, is that it creates an environment where they feel safe and they're willing to take risks.
Yeah. So in that environment, and you talked about the sort of movement backwards and forwards between sort of co-constructing this self-regulation and having it, when could parents expect to see children having that internal sort of, ownership over their self-regulation?
Really, we start to see children's capacity to self-regulate emerges around 3. So very rarely would you see that before that. Sometimes it can be a little bit later. But in terms of their behavioural and emotional self-regulation, like being able to wait your turn, share with someone else, and pack up when you don't want to pack up, those kind of behaviours, we really want to see that happening by around 5. Because when they don't, it actually really impacts their social relationships and also their ability to learn and engage. So it's really the period from 3 to 5 is really that sensitive period from a developmental perspective in terms of developing those self-regulatory skills. In terms of the cognitive components, certainly we want children to pay attention, and that's why often when parents have conversations with early childhood educators around school readiness, the conversations are often about whether children can wait their turn, whether they can pay attention, whether they can remember two-step commands, being asked to go and get your shoes and then go and put them near the door. Because they're the basis of learning and social engagement, and that's why it's really important. So that they're the things that we really want to foster and focus between the ages of 3 and 5.
What about, you talked about there's a 2-step process to things. What about scaffolding learning around self-regulation?
Yeah. So when children are in what I would call the co-regulation phase, there's a lot of things that we can do that can support children's ability to self-regulate. And so what that might be, so when I talked about that idea of a muscle and the environment being quite overwhelming sometimes for children, is what we want to limit, and this is how we co-regulate, we limit the demands that are placed on children. So as they're going through that phase of development, it might be, we talk about choice as being important, so autonomy and choice for children's self-regulation. So I would potentially give you a choice of going out to a restaurant for dinner, and I might say, let's pick between 5 different restaurants. If you've got a child who's around 3, you want to encourage choice and option, but I'd probably say, would you like to wear your red t-shirt today, or would you like to wear your orange t-shirt today? So that would be a form of what I call scaffolding and co-regulation, where you're still giving children an option and a choice, and you're empowering them, but you're also limiting that so the demands are not too overwhelming. So often when children have too many options in play, for instance, we often see that they might wander aimlessly and not engage deeply with anything, as opposed to us kind of structuring the environment in a way that supports their ability to make decisions. So there might be other things, let's say you work full time and you need to get ready for school, and you're continually asking your child to do the same things and they continually forget to do it. We might just put a little process chart on the bathroom door which says, when you get up, remember, you have breakfast, you come and brush your teeth, then you put your school uniform on and you check that your lunchbox is in your bag. And there might be 4 photos that you take with your child that you put there, and that becomes a form of co-regulation until your child gets to the point where they actually know what the morning routine is like. So there's lots of ways. All those, what I talked about before, was those little reminders or timers. So if you know that your child is still developing the ability to follow rules or stop playing when you know that they really want to keep playing, or if they're really tired and you know that if you don't give them warning, they're likely to have a tantrum, then again, that is a form of co-regulation, that you say, I'm going to come and ask you in about 5 minutes. Now, if your child doesn't know what 5 minutes, you might have a little sand timer or point to the hand on the clock. In 5 minutes, I'm going to ask you to pack up. So there's some of the things that we can do during that co-regulation phase, where children may need a warning of a warning.
Great. So just to finish off, what's your number 1 tip for families around building self-regulation? I'm sure you've got 10, but you only get 10.
I do get 1. Wow. So I'm actually just going to say that it's really, for me, it's important taking cues from your child and understanding where they are in terms of their developmental readiness. And so it's around really not having too high an expectation. And for me, it's also around letting children know that it is okay to make mistakes, because that's when children learn. So not having realistic expectations and really supporting children to engage effectively within their environment.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Cathrine.
Thanks, Leanne.